Well, I'm Bill Picorni. I'm a retired Navy captain. During a 30-year Navy career, I had the opportunity to command 4 different organizations. I was the commanding officer of VFA 146 Blue Diamonds and F-18 Fleet Squadron. VFA 125 Rough Raiders was the F-18 training squadron called the RAG, Replacement or Readiness Air Group. And then I was the commander of Carrier Air Wing 11 aboard USS Carl Vinson. And my last command tour was as the commanding officer of Naval ROTC at the University of Florida, which is where I started off as a midshipman 30-some years before. When I was deployed on USS Kitty Hawk as a junior officer, we were overseas, and because the flight deck got too crowded, what they used to do is take one of the 2 A-7 squadrons and put them on a beach deck at QB Point Naval Air Station in the Philippines. And for half the cruise, you'd sit there enjoying the nice life there in a Longapo and QB Point, while the other squadron was on the ship deployed. And then halfway through, the carrier would pull back in the Philippines, swap out squadrons, would go on our half the cruise. So we were sitting at QB Point Air Station for a couple months and flying as much as we could based on the budget we had and everything. And one night I was scheduled to go with another junior officer on a night bombing mission in A-7 Corsairs. The weather was really sketchy. It was really starting to look bad. Now, QB Point sits in an interesting location. As you take off, on one side there are mountains that go up to about 2,500 feet. On the other side, fairly close, is a mountain called S3 Mountain. It was about 6,000 feet high, and it was called S3 Mountain because an S3 a couple years before had collided into the mountain and it killed everybody at night. So it was a little bit of a dangerous place at nighttime. And another bad thing about QB Point was all of the instrument landing systems, precision and non-precision instrument landing systems, as well as their approach radars, had a terrible history of going out of service whenever the weather got bad. So when you really needed them, they typically didn't work, which wasn't really good. So anyway, this particular night, I'm looking at the weather, and I really don't like what I see, but our skipper wasn't really fond of canceling if you were scheduled to fly. So okay, I was going to go. And as we start up the airplanes, my wingman downs his airplane and shuts it down and walks away because something's broken. And I go, great, well, it's just me. But I take off and I fly out, and I'm going to bomb a place called Scarborough Shoals, which is an old beached freighter sitting about 150 miles out to sea, and it's a target that we're allowed to work at. So we're out with 6 practice bombs and start dropping bombs. It's nighttime, and I'm dropping bombs on this old freighter. And okay, that's all done. It's time to come back. As I come back towards QB Point, the weather's getting worse and worse, and I have to stay lower and lower and lower to avoid going into the clouds. So finally, I'm down about 400 feet above the water at nighttime. As I approach the Philippine Islands, to get into QB Point Naval Air Station, the best way to think of it from the ocean is it's like a dog leg left. As you enter, there's about a 60-degree turn you have to make. And because of that, when you're out in the ocean, you really can't see any lights of the air station. It's just all black. The coastline is black. And on this particular night, there were no forward-looking infrared gear. There were no night vision goggles, none of that kind of stuff back then. As I'm looking, we had in the airplane something called a terrain following and terrain avoidance radar, but it never worked. And we had an inertial navigation system, which would have been good in the F-18, but in the A-7, it had a drift rate of about 3 miles per hour of flight time. So you never were completely sure of where you were, especially over the ocean. So as I coming back to try and land, I couldn't see where to go, and I thought, oh man, what do I do? I mean, if I just fly blindly into where I think the channel is, I could very easily run right into S3 Mountain and become another statistic. So I decided to fly up the coast a little bit, and I'm a single-seat A-7 Corsair, and see if I see a break in the weather, and no, it's worse up that way. So I turn back towards Manila, heading south, and it's really bad that way. And I call QB Point to try and find out what the weather is, and all of their systems are down. They have no their TACAN, which is their navigation system, isn't working. No precision GCA ground controlled approaches are working. None of that stuff is. And in fact, they've pretty much closed up shop because the runway, although not below minimums, is pretty doggone close. And so I guess they're almost surprised when I contact them on the radio, and the guy almost looks at me and says, "What are you doing out there?" So I'm looking for a way to get back in. And he says, "Well, everything's down." I said, "Okay. Well, what about Clark Air Base, which is right over the mountains?" And they says, "Clark's already shut down for bad weather." "Okay. How about Manila International? They're shut down for bad weather." So there's no place to land. The only place is QB, and they're still open, but their weather's not particularly good. If I could get in there under this overcast, VFR, visual flight rules, I guess I could land, but I'm scared to death to do it because I'm equally likely to run into S3 Mountain and hit it. So I really don't have any way to get in there, and I'm all by myself. It's nighttime, and I'm starting to get pretty worried. How am I going to land here? And I'm out of ideas. There's no other place to go. So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll climb up high above this stuff, and I'll take a look, and there was a bright moon on top, and I'll see where the clouds break, and maybe I can get in from where the clouds break. And so I climb up to about 22,000 feet before I break out of the clouds. And as I break out on top, it's a nice bright night on top, but I'm pretty surprised to see that the cloud deck goes for as far as you can see. For hundreds of miles, there's clouds, solid overcast. What the heck do I do now? And I'm starting to think about, man, I may have to eject out of a perfectly good airplane because I have no way to get the thing down. Well, for anybody who is not a religious person, all you have to do is fly fighters long enough and you'll become one. And I was. And I got to tell you, I was saying every prayer I could imagine that night to get some help to get back down here. And kind of out of ideas, I decided, I don't know, I'll just looking at the inertial navigation system, I'll fly over top, look at the map display where QB Point's supposed to be and look around and hope for something. As I flew over top QB Point, I'll never forget this. I fly over top and I look down and I see a red neon light. I said, wow. Well, if I can see that light, I'm not going to hit something. And I know the tops of where I am are 2,500 feet. So there's what looked like a sucker hole, like a chimney coming up through the clouds. And I spiraled down through this chimney until I got down to about 5,000 or 6,000 feet. And I could actually read the sign. The red light said the name of a hotel that was basically abeam the runway there at QB. So I knew exactly where I was, knew I wasn't in trouble, kept spiraling down underneath, eventually broke out below the clouds, called to the tower where I was, turned around, came in and landed. About 5 minutes later, the field went completely below minimums. That sucker hole dried up, and the field was shut down for the night. So, am I a religious man? You bet I am. And I think God was in my corner that night. But I'll never forget that one opportunity that I was given to land the airplane, and it worked out. When I took command of VFA 146 Blue Diamonds, a fleet-going F-18 squadron, we were headed out on a combat cruise. I was the executive officer before that, and the change of command was 2 days before we deployed to go off and fly combat missions in support of Operation Southern Watch in Iraq. And tradition at the time held that you'd have this very nice big ceremony down the squadron hangar, the change of command ceremony. After the ceremony, everybody would go to the officers club, and you as the new commanding officer and the leaving commanding officer too split the cost of a big party at the officers club for everybody who came. And then that night there was another party which you typically held in your house as a new commanding officer, and everybody showed up to that and had a big party as well. So that night we're having a party at our house in Lemoore, California, and it was, like I said, 2 nights, 2 days before we were going to deploy. It was in January, so it was an indoor party, and we had probably, 150 people maybe inside our house. And it's one of those open kind of house floor plans, so everybody could get around in all directions. And my wife and I had just bought a brand new refrigerator, and we'd bought this huge General Electric 27.5 cubic foot side-by-side refrigerator. And it was a kind that not only was it side-by-side, but it had a third door in front. They don't make these anymore, but it was supposed to be an energy saver. You open this little third door, and inside was a shelf where you could have drinks. So you didn't have to open the entire refrigerator to get a drink, and just open that up and pull out a drink. Well, there at the party, I had some big barrels, and I had beer on ice in the big barrels in my kitchen there. And along about midnight or so, my intelligence officer, there's good stories about him too, but I'll keep his name out of it. He comes up to me and he says, "Skipper, I need a beer." And I said, "Well, they're right there in those barrels. As those are empty." I said, "Okay, well, there's more in the refrigerator. Just go help yourself." And he goes, "I don't know how to work that thing." All right, so I walked over with him and I opened up the door. And as I opened the door, a hand comes out of my refrigerator handing me a beer. Well, what the heck? And I opened the door, and during the middle of this party with 150 people in there, including myself and my wife, Somehow my junior officers had totally unpacked that refrigerator, taken all the shelves out of it, and a young Navy lieutenant, Bill O'Flynn, who went on to be an astronaut, had climbed inside that refrigerator, and he'd waited in there about 15 minutes waiting on me to come. They could pull this prank on me. It was hilarious, and it just made the night. They did one other thing during that party, too. We used to have an answering machine. It was the kind that had two tapes, cassette tapes. One would play a message, and the next would record your message as you called up, the old analog answering machines. Little did I know that during this same party, the junior officers got to my answering machine. So when we deployed, we'd been at sea for a month or two, and we pulled into Hong Kong. And back then, you didn't have the internet from the ships, and you didn't have email. The only way you could really talk to your wife was you could send letters, which took about 3 weeks in each direction, or when you pulled into port, you could make a phone call. So we pull into Hong Kong, and phone calls were, I think it was about $100 for the first 3 minutes. They were really expensive. So you wanted to get through. So we pull into Hong Kong, and I try to call home, and I get the answering machine. It's not my wife, and it's something I've never heard before. I get this voice on there, and it's our intelligence officer, and he says, "I used to be nobody, but then I got the American Express card, and now I'm the skipper." And in the background, you hear this wild party going on. They had recorded the whole thing during the change of command party. My wife didn't even know about it. People had been telling her how they loved our answering machine tape, and she thought, well, it's just some store-bought, tape that we'd put in there that had a little joke on it. And I had to tell her when I finally got through to her to listen to our answering machine and what these guys had done for us. I think that the single biggest thing that I enjoyed in the Navy more than anything else, including flying fighters, driving aircraft carriers, whatever it might be, the thing that I enjoyed the most and got the most satisfaction out of was the opportunity to help younger people advance in their careers. And to a certain extent, you get to do that every day, but there were certain stories that I can remember, certain instances that stick in my mind, and I'll tell one of those right now. So if I go back to when I was an ensign, just starting out in naval aviation, I had carrier qualified aboard USS Lexington in the T-2 Buckeye and the TA-4 Skyhawk all-day landings, earned my wings of gold, and moved on to the A-7 RAG to learn how to fly the A-7 Corsair. It was a single-seat light attack fighter bomber. I flew the A-7, got through the whole syllabus without too much difficulty, and then it was time to carrier qualify, and that shouldn't be too hard except for one thing. Well, actually, two things. One, this was the first time I would ever land an airplane on an aircraft carrier at night. Had never done that before. And two, the A-7 was a little notorious for having very bad power response. It was a turbofan engine, and the engine wound up very slowly. So it was a difficult airplane to land on an aircraft carrier. It really took a lot of training. To qualify correctly, you needed to have 10-day landings and 6 night landings, arrested landings, on board an aircraft carrier. So the first time we went out to the USS Ranger. And in my 5th landing at night on the USS Ranger, I almost had a ramp strike and almost exploded in a ball of flame. I landed so short that the tailhook hit about 2 feet down the round down on the back of the ship, right on the center line, put a dent back there, and the wheels barely missed hitting the back. And had it been another foot or so, I might have seen a big fireball, but it didn't. I kind of skidded, hook skipped, the hook came up, bounced off the belly pan of the airplane, hook skipped the 1, 2, 3, and caught the 4-wire when the hook dropped back down. So that disqualified me, and I had to go home not qualified. So they gave me a second chance. About a month later, I went out this time to the Lexington, and this time I got all my landings, and everything was fine. And when I was done, the landing signal officers, or LSOs, came up to me, and they said, well, we're sorry to tell you this, but your landing grades weren't good enough, so we're going to have to disqualify you again. Well, that was it. That was probably the end of my time in naval aviation, because 2 tries is about all you get at doing this kind of thing. In fact, they kind of said, well, it's time to fly. We were in Pensacola, and we were based out of Lemoore, California. Said, okay, we're going to fly the jets. The A-7's back down to Lemoore, but of course, guys who disqualified, we're not going to let you fly them back. Only the guys who qualified, and instructors will fly the other planes back. And they told me, you can hang out in Pensacola for 3 or 4 days and fly back on the airlift with the enlisted troops that were going back. Well, I didn't want to do that, so I bought a plane ticket, flew back on the airlines, and realized that my career in the Navy was probably over. But it wasn't, so they held a board, and a board of officers convened to talk to me about whether I deserved to have a 3rd chance to get on the aircraft carrier and qualify. And nobody ever got 3 chances. It just didn't happen. Nobody could ever remember it happening. So I went through a qualification board and talked about it, and they asked me what I was going to do differently. And one of the things I did differently in the third chance was the first two times out, they used to tell you not to turn on the heads-up display, to leave it off. Well, my third time out, the landing signals officers told me, because they did give me a third chance, they taught me how to use the heads-up display and turn it on. So this time we go out aboard the USS Lexington again. I get the third opportunity, which nobody had ever had that they were aware of. And I not only qualified, I did the best in my whole class. So I went on to a 30-year naval career, kind of worked out for the Navy. In fact, I ended up being one of less than 300 naval aviators in the history of the Navy to have more than 1,000 landings on aircraft carriers, finishing with 1,137 landings on 10 different carriers. But anyway, the point of the story is, fast forward 20 years. 20 years later, I'm now the commanding officer of VFA 125, which is the RAG for the F-18 squadrons. We teach all the new F-18 pilots. So one day, the LSOs come up to me, the landing signals officers that work for me came up and they said, "Hey, Skipper, we just had to disqualify this young man. He just had his second try at the boat. He didn't make it. He's disqualified twice, and that's all we're going to, he's done. We're going to have to boot him out." And I looked at my LSOs and I said, "Tell me what you did differently the second time with him from the first time." And they looked back at me and said, "Well, we gave him a second chance. I mean, we don't do things any different. We gave him a second chance." And I couldn't help but remember 20 years before when those LSOs had taught me to turn on the HUD and how to use it and what a difference it had made for me. And they argued that the guy had had 2 chances. Nobody ever got 3 chances, so he should be booted out. And I looked at him and said, "No, you're going to give him a third chance to qualify in the F-18. I had looked through his record. His record was good in every other phase of instruction. I said, "You find some different way to get through to him to turn the light bulb on and make it work, and I'm holding you responsible to do that." Well, they walked off a little disgusted, I guess, but they took that kid back to the boat a third time, and guess what? He finished top of his class on his third opportunity. So I felt pretty good about that, but I sort of forgot about it, and about 6 or 7 months later, he had done so well that they actually sent him out to a forward deployed squadron out in Japan. And when he's out in Japan, about 6 months later, I got a Christmas card from him. And it said, "Hey, Skipper, I just wanted to tell you I finished in the top 10 in my air wing of all landing grades, and I never would have even had the chance if you hadn't given me a third chance to go to the boat. Thanks a lot." Well, that really sunk in. I mean, it was really cool to kind of complete the circle there and remember what had been done for me, because some very caring officers had taken care of me and given me a third opportunity when some people weren't willing to do that. I had the chance to return the favor 20 years later, and it worked out the same way. That's pretty cool. Every naval officer I ever met who was worth his salt, every good leader I ever met, I think feels the same way. Feels that, yeah, flying the jets was great, and the combat missions are memorable and all this kind of stuff, but when it's all said and done, it's how you could help other people that were under your command or that you worked with that really sticks with you more than anything else.